to start with, Tallinn Architecture Biennale this year emphasizes that it's bringing together technology, biology, and architecture. And somehow, when we look at what is happening in architecture schools around the world and in Europe today, all of the thematics of the Biennale this year brings about a quite important field for exploration on what's happening with architecture education today. I'm myself involved at the Estonian Academy of Arts, Faculty of Architecture, and before we continue, may I ask you all to say a few words about where you're coming from and what is the school that you represent. So maybe we start with Thomas. Yeah. We need a microphone. Yeah.
Hello everyone, I'm Tomas Grunskis. I'm from Vilnius Academy of Arts, Department of Architecture, teaching the same thing as you, probably all of you. Yeah, that's it.
Yes, hello, I'm Kristi Krishakov. I'm from Tallinn Technical University, and I run the landscape architecture programs there.
Hello, my name is Martin Melioranski. I teach at the Estonian Academy of Arts, Faculty of Architecture, for the past 15 years straight. Before that, I taught a bit at Columbia University in New York, and at Estonian Academy of Arts, I also run a small or expanding small lab called 3L.
Hello, I am Anastasios Tellios. I come from Thessaloniki, Greece, and I teach at School of Architecture at the Aristotle University there.
Hi, I'm Renee Puusepp, and I'll come here from the Estonian Academy of Arts. I'm a senior researcher and a lecturer.
Morning. I am Tomomi Hayashi, Japanese architect, who has been practicing here for last 16 years, and I have been involved with TTK University of Applied Sciences here in Estonia for a few years, and yeah, thank you.
Good morning, my name is Rolf Hughes. I'm a researcher in the Experimental Architecture Group at Newcastle University, and before that I've been working in Stockholm for many years as head of research at Stockholm University of the Arts.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Armstrong. I'm a professor of experimental architecture at Newcastle University.
Good morning, I'm Ioannis Lykouras. I'm also from Greece, but I've practiced here the last 3 years, and I've also been involved in the Tallinn Technical University in some studios. Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jaan Kuusemets. I'm also teaching in Tallinn Technical University, and me and Ioannis, we're also running architectural office in Tallinn and having practicing architects.
So we're very happy to have both the more academic side as well as the practitioner side in this panel. Perhaps my first question to you all, and I see Areti and Kristina have arrived, so please join us. You're not late at all. We've just started to introduce ourselves and talk a little bit. Now that we are all deaf, apologies for that. It was me too close to the speakers. So we've Areti and Kristina with us. Can you please say just a few words about where you're coming from as the Brest also introduced their institutions.
So my name is Kristina Schinegger. I'm the Dean of Studies and Professor for Structure and Design at the University of Innsbruck, and have my own practice as an architect called SOMA, and before I was teaching at the Bartlett.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everybody. Sorry for my delay. I am Areti Markopoulou. I'm coming from Barcelona. I'm the academic director of the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia. So I am based in Spain, but I am originally Greek. And back in Barcelona, we are working with AIAC, which is a kind of a peculiar center of experimentation in architecture. It's not a kind of a university as an institution, so we're working on, let's say, envisioning, but also applying the future of architecture with our students and researchers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, as I said earlier, we have people here from both from the more academic side as well as from the real actual practice building buildings, such as Dagop and Jaan and Ioannis are representing, or others here, Tomo, Renee. My first question to you all would be that, considering, and we have Bart Lootsma, would you like to join us on? This is a wonderful situation to have Bart Lootsma as audience. To start with, an example from the Estonian Academy of Arts, then let's say for the PhD program that I'm involved with, to the large part, what we try to do is to offer venturous practitioners a possibility to research into their practice. Now, thinking of Christopher Freiling's words and his this triad for research, or defining what research in architecture might be, then he has offered this triad of research into, research through, and research for practice when we talk about creative practice research. So this research into could be a more historic or an approach that historians would have, or that look into architecture from this perspective of a historian or a theoretician. Then there's research through practice, which means that we have a design problem, and we try to explore certain grounds through practice, and then come to results, original, rigorous results through practice. And then there is something that's for practice, which then tries to look at where the practitioner and then the field, or the practitioner in the field might want to move next, and what is happening for the field in itself. So perhaps my first question to you all would be, what do you consider a proper body of knowledge and research relevant for the field of architecture?
I'll start because my background is not in architecture originally. Originally I trained as a medical doctor, and then I have done a PhD in architecture. And the relationship for me was I was used to designing the body, but I wasn't used to designing the environment. And so between those two practices, there became a much kind of fuller range of questions that I, as a researcher, could address. And I think that the question is really, what is architecture in the 21st century? Because whether it's with, for, or in architecture, really needs a situated set of arguments as to what architectural skills can do. So, for example, I've been working with architecture and chemistry, and it's been really interesting because traditionally chemistry does not deal with spatial relationships between substances. So when you start to introduce space and time into chemistry, a different set of possibilities take place. So obviously, you know, I'm from an academic background, but for me, really the question is, you know, what are the skills to do with space, its choreography, matter, time? You know, how can they be applied in the 20th century so that we have a vision of, you know, perhaps the way that we're living and being and inhabiting spaces.
Anyone want to pick up on that?
Maybe just to a bit kind of add or kind of explain my own view on the three kind of areas for practice-based research. I would say that all of these are important for if you're really a practitioner. I also practice, and I mean, maybe academically it's kind of relevant and necessary to distinguish these kind of focuses, but in practice, I don't know. It really depends on what you're after and what's your kind of task there. And yeah, as for what's relevant as an architectural research, I would say that in some ways one could say that if it kind of involves you fully and it starts to interest other people in practice as well, then there might be something relevant there, at least a kind of promise of relevance.
Mm-hmm.
We had a similar debate a few weeks ago, and we came up with this notion that architecture and the act of designing is essentially research, and as long as it's been envisioning, a new future for the world or for where we're about to live and work and act. And I think it comes up in the end to placing the right questions, so that the research can be triggered and answered properly. And then, like Rachel said, I mean, if the question is about chemistry and the expansion of scales outside chemistry, then we have research. But essentially, when we're trying to design something new, then it's fundamentally, the basis of research.
Just continuing a bit on this, I would say that architecture is a discipline that by default is very difficult to innovate at, no? Because it is strictly related with the construction sector, which is strictly related with strict regulations, which is very difficult to change and which is very difficult to adapt into novel ideas, and it's very difficult to allow space for experimentation to happen. So how research has been and innovation has been coming and emerging into architecture has been always through connection or even just from other disciplines, no? Innovation and research into the material science, into automation, into engineering or bioengineering or synthetic biology lately, no? So other disciplines are the ones that they are really influencing and preparing the space for architectural experimentation and research to happen. So I would say that what is very fundamental into the research practice, into the education, or into the, let's say, both education and practice, is to try to merge those disciplines, is to try to bring all these disciplines together and apply them into architecture with pilot projects that they are not necessarily need to be outside in the real reality. They can be in our garden, or that they can be in our terrace, or they can be in the patio of a big company, but we really need big and pilot projects to test those experiments, to test that research. And I think then it would be making much more sense into bringing that into reality.
I think it's also important to think what is architecture, and because in the recent years the border of the field of architecture is like expanding, and what is really what we can consider as architecture, what is related to architecture.
Yes, please, Rolf, and then Kristina.
I think probably we will also have to expand this question a bit, because I think it's kind of interesting that as architects we're really occupied with always asking ourselves, what is architecture? But I think we should start asking what can we do with architecture, and I think that goes into the direction what Rachel Armstrong said, that I really like the definition of that let's say the spatial approach is something that's unique for architecture, and I think if we keep this in mind, we probably also can manage that, what you're pointing at, that we have this dispersal of architecture at the moment that is so interdisciplinary that in education or even in practice we sometimes come to that point where we say, okay, but how do we get back to a certain point of depth again, of real expertise in something? So, but probably the question, what do we want to do with it, is something that could give us a hint.
Yeah, probably all of us would agree that all of us we are trying to answer this question you're mentioning one and another way, but all of us will agree that the concept of contemporary architecture is expanded already. It's not separated from research anymore in any way. Research cannot exist without architecture, and architecture in our field without research. But I would like to suggest some sort of approach which actually maybe explains a bit the situation. That I imagine 3 pillars of contemporary architecture and state of it. One is that it's dealing with the phenomena of space. One and another day is linked with the processes of any kind and social, and also we are. The third pillar could be we think about the matter which could be used in or through architecture. But all 3 of these pillars usually have to be developed through research, and all these aspects actually puts architecture above the practice of everyday architecture. Somehow it gives us logic, a different logic to consider its use or its place in the society and so on. So the conceptualization of such a kind could somehow give us a sort of direction of thinking about it. All what is happening in Biennale right now, one and another way, is linked with these phenomena, processes, and matters. And these things are mentioned quite widely in many theoretical works of our days. So maybe the answer could be this kind of approach, conceptualization. I'm not sure, but yeah.
My one point was also that nowadays the architecture dealing with virtual reality and augmented reality, and it's also like a kind of totally, phenomenon.
I'd like to reflect on your question, maybe rephrase it a little bit. So what is the proper body of knowledge? So maybe the question is how to create this proper body of knowledge in architecture. And I think that you can't just do it simply by designing. I mean, the act of design itself doesn't create knowledge yet. So you somehow need to reflect it. And the reflection and bringing the kind of learning from designing, So, and the question is then how you reflect it. And so you create the project or you build a building and you somehow need to analyze it. So, and bring this analysis back to your practice. And it's this circular feedback that creates this thorough research. Either you analyze it, you can analyze a project by doing a wind analysis, or you can do a solar analysis, or you could actually, if you create the building, you can just analyze by observing. So you can see how people use it. It's called the post-occupancy survey, right? So, and in my opinion, that's where you're getting closer to a sort of proper research.
I guess that's why also Christopher Frayling offered the triad in a way that it's reflection into reflection for and reflection through. That there is that level of reflection always emphasized, that this is what is needed. But there are, speaking of experimentation and pilot projects and such, this requires a framework and quite a large effort to actually pull those things through and create frameworks for meaningful experimentation. So what might be your experiences so far, how to set such a framework in an academic world, in an architecture school?
I could try, I'm speaking as a non-architect, but I could try to link that question to the previous one, because by making a distinction between a context of discovery and a context of enrollment or legitimization. So the context of discovery is where the emphasis falls upon the quality of what's being learnt, and the typical mode for that is experimentation. The context of justification or legitimization is when the mode is typically explanation. So it's things like reflection, using the tools of the humanities to analyze and to understand your given practice, to bring that back, to strengthen your practice and so on. But they're not mutually opposite fields. They're typically also integrated into each other. But I think it's useful to actually make that distinction, because when I hear terms like proper research, I start to wonder, what is proper research? Is it that the architects are looking for approval by an external authority source, such as the humanities, by doing a bit of theory, a bit of history, and then explaining and apologizing for their practice? Or is it actually letting the practice drive forward the research into new forms? So with the context of discovery, what a mode might be, for example, is a form of radical juxtaposition between different types of practices. And of course, that leads to reflection, to understand what's happened, but actually the mode is rather creating prototypes and models that lead to a form of immersive experience, I would say. And that then becomes that is a performance or an artifact or a prototype that facilitates a research type conversation. It's not an illustration of an idea that is sort of preformed. I think it's in order to justify the distinctive qualities of architectural practice, I think it's quite useful to think about those sort of terms, because the paradox of architecture for me is that it's both a nascent discipline, it's constantly coming into being and being reformed, and at the same time it has this long history in relationship to a set of conventions and an investment in a notion of authorship and so on. So that sort of combination, I think, creates a quite interesting tension. And then you could, to follow that point through, to play devil's advocate, I could say that architecture is more important than architecture. So in other words, you might want to think about areas of application for architecture which would not conventionally be called architecture. And then you're again in that sort of context of discovery sort of mode.
I think, okay, maybe I just jump in that listening to those speeches, I think that maybe we are admitting that the architecture is influenced by the other disciplines. Maybe if we look at this postmodernism time, we are not we are, but the previous architects were borrowing semiotics and linguistics and those ideology into architecture to redefine what architecture is, or to define the problems what we need to tackle on. But then it seems that maybe we are still in the same position, borrowing the other ideas to define ourselves, or can we do it the other way around? Or maybe, this is my feeling nowadays, or in the past few years, or maybe past 10 years, that it seems that the other disciplines have started looking into architecture, or maybe they were interested in what we are doing, or maybe they discovered how important this spatial issue is, or how we use, or these fundamental things of the space itself is interesting to them. It seems that they are started following us. Maybe this is a good chance that we don't need to any more feel that we are following them, but maybe we are on the equal ground, or maybe we are touching with the other issues. Maybe they can come along later on. This is my idea. Thank you.
And can I follow up on that? In that I think that we also need to think about the context for research. So, for example, in universities, there's a particular framework for assessment. Certainly in the UK, we're subjected to the research exercise framework. And really, the modes of justification for that are essentially scientific. They're empirical methods, they are associated with data and certain forms of proof. There's another context for research, which is within practice, within a certain economic and social political condition where architecture has become part of the building industry, and there are certain forms of validation there, maybe economic, maybe kind of iconic, and that kind of practice has certain sets of value. So those two different landscapes are very different. And then there's a personal research, which are those personal obsessions that ultimately drive everything. And without that kind of research, your own practice never matures. And yet, depending on the context, those aspects of the production of space and the way places are inhabited, are viewed very differently. And I think Rolf's kind of interjection is interesting in the sense that architecture has access to both artistic and scientific methods, and it also engages humanities. So it has a very broad portfolio of possibilities. And it really, you can really call upon many different ways of looking at your kind of fundamental, passion and curiosity from a range of different modes of communication. And I think research is more than a communication. That there's a kind of body of knowledge, so I just think that when we're talking about research, I think that we kind of need to think about the context, because I think that any designer with passion is continually doing that, but the ways of communicating that have not been over-formalized or have not been formalized. And I think that that's where the nascent potentiality of kind of new forms of practice really kind of is driven from. The others is an outward gaze onto how we're doing, how we're being assessed, and how maybe we're seen within a form of economic landscape.
I wanted to connect that also to being apologetic and trying to somehow prove that we can do research as well somehow, because the multidisciplinarity that exists already since the beginning and now we cannot even control somehow brings us into a situation where we are in the little parts theoretically less equipped to do research than all the other people that are already doing research in this field. So maybe it's not, maybe research through design can be our excuse to be the specialists. Because the body of knowledge that you asked about, we don't know it, and it might be expanding, might be diminishing in the next years. We cannot, as we cannot know what architecture is, then we don't also know what the body of knowledge is. But if the importance is not the body of knowledge, but what makes our research methodology different than the other ones, maybe we can stop being apologetic by finding a way to do research through for a different goal and not necessarily knowing the start.
Exactly, that we shouldn't pretend to be someone else than what we are.
No, exactly. I think that's a good point, and I'd like to also link that to Rachel's point, because I've been in Scandinavia for the last 20 years building this sort of area, the field of artistic research, and at the beginning of that process, people were using very much the tools of the essay. There were lots of theorists and lots of philosophers in the field who were, teaching practitioners how to theorize or talk about their work. There's nothing wrong with that, but as practitioners gained the confidence of their own knowledge and their ability to look at what they're doing and not look at outside sources, then slowly the actual format of communication changed from the essay to justify the work to what I have called exposition, or staging an encounter with the work, be it a model or an artifact or a combination, a performance, but staging an encounter with the work such that the research contribution becomes explicit, or at least becomes communicated to a given audience. And what that demands in turn is a different type of literacy, it seems to me. Because if you have an architect that goes over into essay writing, that architect learns the sort of things that I learned at university, which is how to write essays and so on, but not necessarily speaking through the logic of architecture. But if the architect then communicates the contribution of her or his work through architecture, then the audience, and let's hope that it's an audience that is not just a community of peers, in other words, fellow architects, but also those from outside the practice of architecture, who can come and they can unpack the expressive qualities of the work and the nuances of the work, and they can connect it to their research as well. Because then the work, as a work of exposition, has communicated not only to the fellow peers, but also in research terms to other disciplines, which means an import-export game becomes possible, and that will likely enrich the research.
Yeah. And one thing I would like to remind that you mentioned an important word, experimentation framework. So we speak about the research and tools and which are common for our profession, for our field, but for experimentation you have to put yourself away from the safe zone as usual, and it's some sort terra incognita for architects still. It is, and we just agreed that concept of architecture is changed and tools are changed already. But I usually provoke my students to move themselves to the mode of broken pencil, saying stop designing, stop design. It also means start reading, and also it means go and do your research work by foot, by reflection, by observation, and do things which are not common for you for everyday practical practice. But one thing is, this approach has a deeper meaning. It means that all of us, we work in the same closed system of architecture. We speak same language. We can understand each other. But it means also that the system is normally closed. And approach which I would rather provoke to think about is how to open our discipline for real, how to open it to others in all possible ways. And that means that the experimentation could be more, practical in our field, but it would make our discipline more accessible. And this means impacts, conversation, discussions, and other things. I have this strange practice with European Humanitarian University with the sociologists who try to research the city with architects, and strangely they argued so much that they couldn't produce any work in 1 week. So for me it meant that they tried to communicate in two enclosed systems. So for experimentation, the open mind or open system should be somehow developed and presented to others. That's possibly the one of approaches, maybe.
Yeah. I actually kind of want to take from there in a way that it's not only the experimentation for a certain building or project or artifact, but also the experimentation of collaboration that probably is less formal in academic environment, and it might be and probably is of interest to practitioners, not just architectural practitioners, but other practitioners in different fields. And what's kind of interesting, we sometimes might think that with this kind of really multidisciplinary thing, we kind of blur everything, and it's kind of really almost vague. What's it to be an architect? But when you, in a way, realize in these collaborations with different researchers, from different backgrounds, it's really that modes of thinking for architects are sometimes rather different, and that also might be of interest to other fields.
I think it's quite interesting that there seems to be this insecurity about our own discipline. And honestly, if we look back at the last, centuries of architectural production, architecture has been research always. So like every building, let's say what we call architecture, probably not what we call everyday building, but has been a prototype or experimentation. And also when we look at theory, we always had an integral part of research and theory, architecture theory, history. You know, there always was architectural research. So I think we should be far more confident. And just probably as a personal story, how I came to research, I did not come to research through academia at all. I just had my own office and we had to build a kinetic facade and we did not know how to do it. And then we just called up Jaan and sat together with him and then we developed a patent together and we wrote our papers about it, and I did not need any methodology or anything. I just did research by what I was doing anyhow. And I think now I'm really happy for the conversation because the second part there's space and spatial organization, but there's also design. And I think we should not forget that we are designers, right? But we have this expertise for centuries.
I think it's also important for architects and designers to analyze the designing process itself. And through this, we can also do the research through practice and so on.
But picking up from what Kristina said, what is it then that we do as designers? One way to interpret what you said is that we are in a continuous loop for producing prototypes, that we are, whatever we do, we are figuring out a way to build something in a new way, in an innovative way, to bring something else to the foreground. But what it is that we do as designers?
I think what we do is so much open to interpretations in a much, much bigger degree than other disciplines are. What I mean, we cannot answer a question, is this design right or wrong? Or is this building right or wrong? Which is an absurd question to start with, but in so many other professions and disciplines, it's a nice question to ask. So in a way, it's as long as we depend on borrowing things from other disciplines and then pieces from other sciences, we will be always struggling to validate what we do as a proper piece of research, in the traditional scientific way. So in a way, to me, I mean, it's this third part of research, the personally driven, push through what really pushes us from the inside to deal with. It's a safe way, through the research, or what you said about you had to design a kinetic facade, so you just had to do it.
Applied research also, of course.
And follow up this closed circle that we operate in. I think it's self-proven in a way.
Rachel wants to jump.
I really like this question about what is design. And having worked in science, I mean, I'm going to attempt at how I see design, which is that when science does research, it's atomistic. It will keep looking downwards for answers. And what I find really interesting about what design does is actually it's synthetic. It's actually much more horizontal in its approach, and it manages to synthesize ways forwards in incredibly complex environments which involve people and space and matter and shape and function in a way that really science doesn't. Science simplifies an environment to a point where there's, where we have a situation of control and then looks downwards for those answers. And design has a very horizontal field of possibility. And I find it, and I think the reason that there are so many different expressions of design is because actually that field is so much more vast and it can never be completely known, which is very, very different to other forms of research.
So basically, what you're saying is what we do exploration. And while doing this exploration, we do create knowledge. The problem of that perhaps is that this knowledge is often embedded, so it's in the head of the researcher, or it's actually in the buildings, but it's still embedded, it's not made explicit. So it's not, and again, this is a problem of communication. When we learn to do that better, we'll be able to explain how we done things, how we done these prototypes, and also reflect on the buildings that we've done.
I also, you said that the design is like horizontal, more or less, but in my opinion or in my experience, by analyzing the designing process, the designing is very often, I would say, chaotic.
Yeah, I would just quickly add that we've been talking about architecture and design and analysis, but we could say that analysis is a kind of form of disassembly in a way, and in many cases, I guess, in sciences, it stays there as a number or a kind of fixed result, but why design is important is that we manage architecturally, put things back together in a, maybe sometimes in some ways not so directly justifiable ways, but there's another connotation maybe that arises.
There's also saying that the creation appears from the chaos.
Areti, I think you.
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead. Okay. No, yeah, I would just could I add to that thought that I think what Rachel said about the vertical and horizontal is very, very true. And I think that is also why it is so difficult to explain the design process, because there's no such a format of academic article where you could actually explain the whole complexity that you're working with. And then we tend to mystify things. So it just, we say things like you said just now, chaotic, or mystify somehow our architect's profession. But then I think we should come up with some kind of, what we have talked here today as well about communication. So what kind of either academic article format or research format would allow us then to communicate this actual complexity, because all the normal tools or writing formats, they don't allow us to actually communicate it very well. We would have to write, I don't know, 100 or 200 pages for each architecture project what we do. And then one thing more, which I wanted to add it already before to this body of knowledge topic actually, and which we haven't discussed a lot, is actually the concept of time. And Rachel mentioned it a little bit already, but I think architects work a lot with time. So we already mentioned this historical approach, but we also work a lot with future, and architects talk a lot about future. But actually what I do with my research is that I work with future study methods and future thinking, and then actually explore different modes of thinking that we use when we think about future. And I think this is lacking a lot from architects' kind of education, especially if we want to prepare them to do research, any kind of research, that they actually also understand where their thinking, future thinking comes from. So what kind of futures are they actually looking for?
Getting a bit back to the issue of design, or what is it that we're designing and what is design for? To me, what is fascinating about design is the fact that as designers we get to, let's say, create, quote unquote, the software and the hardware of part of our contemporary societies, part of the context where we are living in. And in design there are linear ways to approach and non-linear ways to approach. If we think that the design or the rethinking of a plastic bottle of water is a very, very interesting approach of how we design. But there is a non-linear process, or I don't know how to call it, maybe more emergent, that is not tackling the way of how we're designing a plastic bottle, but the way that we're drinking water. And to me that is really the fascinating part of the design, that we can rethink how we do things. We can work through design to contribute, to create, or to make better, or to define certain inhabitation models and certain, and also give replies and solutions to certain problematics that they are being posed from our everyday life and interactions. So that is why I think design is powerful, and the processes and approaches might vary and might be vertical or horizontal or like more networked and three-dimensional, but that is the power of design for me.
In other words, could it then be that what you suggest is that we as designers are able to get closer or have smarter ways of thinking of a problem, that it's a question of designing the problem first and then actually offering a variety of solutions for it for the solution to emerge, that there is no one answer to a problem, but there is a multiplicity of different solutions that we could offer, and we can explore that field.
I think that's a nice, both are very good ways of putting it, because it brings the designer into the role of the person that is reconfiguring the question all the time, and in that sense it makes the designer and the researcher the same sort of figure. Because if you don't do that, then it seems to me that anyone engaged in a mono practice, a single practice, risks the sort of the cul-de-sac of virtuosity. In other words, you know what you're doing, you get better and better at what you're doing, you do it faster or more brilliantly or better than anyone else, and it's a pursuit of virtuosity, but it's a sort of dead end in a sense after a certain way. And where then conventionally you think, so what is the difference between a designer and a researcher? And the answer is, I think this was put very nicely by Thomas with the broken pencil idea, but you endanger the prototype. You create a process or you create a model and you endanger it. You defamiliarize it in certain ways. So you work against your expertise in certain ways in order to think about the quality of thinking or the quality of learning that's taking place rather than the virtuosity of the execution. So there is a way in which both these sort of energies can come together, I think, and I think they do come together both in terms of disciplinarity and in terms of research, and that is that the one energy is you could think of as a vertical energy to do with strengthening, going deeper into a practice, and the other one is maybe a horizontal one, which is where you are pushing at the boundaries of a given practice, at the very limits of a practice to say, actually, is this still architecture now, or am I going into something else? And therefore you create T-shaped practitioners, because it's not that one is better than the other, but the combination of those two sort of forms of curiosity or motivation or energy actually drive a discipline and a given practice forward, I think. There's one last point, which is the idea of if designers are, as we've just been saying, the people who are very good at reconfiguring questions or the question that they're working with, how is it that one accesses what Zizek has called the forgotten fourth category of knowledge? In other words, the forms of knowledge that we don't even know that we don't know. Because he gives three other versions of knowledge before that, but the fourth one is the interesting one. And that is like saying to a practitioner, what are the boundaries of my practice and what are the consequences of my answer to that question? What lies beyond that boundary and how might I bring it in usefully to my practice?
Can I just follow up as well, because I think Areti's intervention was great there. I think there's a very interesting thing about the slippage between subjectivity and objectivity. So it's normally within let's say a science-based research framework, you're looking for objectivity. Subjectivity is mere opinion. And I think one of the really interesting things about this means that we need to invent our modes of evaluation. How do we know that's a good one? That's really hard. That's as hard as the design itself. But I think if the design and arts and humanities are not going to be subject to a scientification, that it is just as important for us to invent the modes of evaluation of our own work, which means declaring our value systems, declaring those things that are important to us, and really figuring out how we can grow and evolve that as an integrated discipline.
And bringing the body into architecture, because objectivity represses the body. I was just going to say, and part of that is bringing the body into architecture, because the notion of objectivity is about the repression of the body and all its specific sensory experiential knowledge.
I think that I also like that always because I think what Areti pointed out was so important. Architecture and design is about innovation, and I think we have this. We really always want to be inventive, and that's what drives all these scientists that we're working together so crazy. I just was recently talking to an engineer who is now said he has found the most valid model or the most valid method to build a complex surface. And I said, guess what? Architecture is not interested in complex surfaces anymore. And he was really frustrated. And he didn't get it. Why would we always look for something new when we've reached something, right? So we are not looking for that objectivity, stable ground. We're always looking for what's next. And I think that's something we should estimate as something incredibly precious about our discipline also.
It could be said that the word would be imagination as well. We build a base or a kind of basis for maybe feeling more confident and then look forward and imagine by images, maybe like Juhani Pallasmaa might say.
Can I actually pick up on the idea of the T-shaped practices? I quite like it, and it's in the startup, technology startups, in the sort of startups are also called T-shaped. They kind of horizontal, but they have to go very deep into a certain subject to actually be successful. And in that sense, most of architectural practices are startups. They still looking for their business model and trying to find, actually constantly looking for something. Only perhaps different are the big commercial practices that kind of found their business model. So and in the way I think they're doing less research because they kind of established it. They established the body of knowledge they have. They formalized it. They kind of almost written it down, whether it's in the, I don't know, in the procedures of their how they do their business and how they produce architecture. But I mean, and then they have the R&D departments, but it's more like a marketing department, in my opinion. So I guess it's just a reflection. No big point coming out from here, but it's, I found the T-shape quite interesting, and I think there's so much truth in it, and yeah. So I guess the small practices, especially, are the ones that are haven't really established themselves in that sense. I mean, in different sense they have, but they still kind of. They haven't formalized, and the act of formalization maybe itself is something that even makes them boring. I mean, they kind of establish themselves, and that's where the exploration goes.
I quite like what Martin threw up in the air about imagination. That it's bound to our capacity to imagine what the future might hold for us as designers to move forward in our thinking, in our designing, in our reflection, etc. But as we're all engaged in architecture schools here and there, how do we push this capacity to imagine for students and for researchers and for the people that we're working with? How can we do that?
It's different every year. It really depends on the students as well, not only the teacher. Yeah, of course, one constantly tries to kind of think through this process and maybe, exploit certain methods sometimes even.
But architectural education is, to quite a large extent, based on a studio system. So it's often a small group of students or a team of research that then works on a problem or in a certain context. What kind of a framework does that offer?
I think there are a couple of things that I believe that they are important into let's say, preparing an education or space for learning that could empower creativity and imagination. No? The first one is what I always like to say, let the people play. No, let the students play, which means that do not give them a specific brief. Do not tell them exactly what they need to do as step by step or week by week, no? Put them together with other students that they are doing other topics or other disciplines or they're studying different things. Put them together just in the same place. Don't do anything about it. They will do it. They will start to interact. Learn by doing. No, this is also fundamental. I like the broken pencil idea, but I like more the idea of getting our hands dirty. I like the idea of people prototyping, because that is the only way that they can learn. And then, you know, like design and prototyping and construction are becoming a circle. And last but not least, which is something that it's not always very easy, is to not teach them. To maybe teach them how to learn, but not teach them. No, not like passing your knowledge to them, because your knowledge might be outdated in no time. No? How can we learn together? This is something that at least back in Barcelona we're really struggling to achieve, and we believe that the environment, also the space, is fundamental to do that. No? Like no more sterilized environments of monodirectional knowledge, no? But kind of bidirectional relationships.
Okay. Yeah. I'm thinking teaching, it's very important how we can motivate and inspire students to get them excited, because if the students are not motivated or inspired, they become lazy. It's not a question about are we letting them play or just figure out things, but most important to get the students inspired and motivated. And then it's also very important for us as teachers to ask right questions and so on.
Asking right question at the right timing, that's we need to keep it in mind. But one thing I try to do is, this is again relating to this T idea that the student needs to understand what is important for them. So this is going deeper into her or himself, but then at the same time we ask them to go around, look around, eat everything around, the experiment, what they like. No, this is again the horizontal thing. I think we should ask both directions to go, because otherwise you get empty if you just go into downside, or if you just are looking around, you're not reflecting on what you are. So I think you should again use this T model.
I'm just going to bring up an example because you invited us to work with Christy. And so the teaching method that we were using there, and what we try to do in experimental architecture, is to bring research alongside kind of the professional body, so that students have the technical proficiency that they need to be architects, but also then we introduce elements of research. And so one of the things we did was a workshop with Christy and her landscape students, and essentially we used immersive techniques, as Areti was talking about, and gave them a completely different tool set through which they would experience a landscape, and then we invited them back to their classroom then to build prototypes.
Yeah, and if to just add to the workshop that we did with Rolf and Rachel, my own personal reflection, then I think what happened there is that future students learned the most from the assignments which made them very uncomfortable in the beginning. So I thought that in the beginning that it was supposed to be more about design process, but actually the performance part and writing about their work, not in a scientific sense, but in an, let's say, artistic sense, was the most challenging to them in the end. Yeah.
I was just going to add on to that as a general point in response to your question, which is make the students storytellers, good storytellers, not because they'll tell a prettier story about the project or you're less likely to fall asleep, but because storytelling is the tool by which we evaluate and engage with the complexities and contradictions of experience. And so if you're putting architecture into the world, you're not just thinking about an object into the world, but also the entire context around it, and the bodies inside it, and its past and present and future and so on. So there's a lot of parameters there that you can pick upon to start telling different types of stories about the significance of what you're proposing to the world. And I think the techniques of, I would also go further and say also things like theatre and performance, because, I've been to too many presentations where, architect stands there and flicks through PowerPoint things and said, this is a project I did in 2008, or was it 2009? No, it's 2008, and it was, it was a collaboration with blah, blah architects, and it is actually a description. It's not a story, but a chronology, and not compelling, and it doesn't bring the audience into closer contact with the often brilliant sort of, qualities of the work that's being shown. But that's because, those students or those architects have not really thought about the actual interface of audience with their work, and they can learn a lot about that from things like theatre and things like storytelling, and here we are in a space in a row facing an audience. So, architects, heal thyselves.
Just to add quickly to the kind of motivation question, how do we motivate the students? Fabio Gramaccio once, when I spoke to him, put it quite directly that we have to let the students have a sense of achievement, because all these experimentations and innovation, as we speak here, is can be quite a tedious and long process sometimes before you arrive there. But how do you build up this kind of sense of achievement along the way as well?
I was thinking, not so much as a teacher, because that I did for very little time, but from the side of a student, maybe one of the most interesting ways to get somebody to think as wide as possible is to introduce them to a method or a way of putting the question that although you know the final goal, you have a project or you have a specific deadline or a specific task, not how to go the most straightforward way you think into that, especially when you're very young and you can probably only imagine one way. But how can you on purpose divert this cause, even if it would cost the efficiency and even the result of the project, but make the student go? And one of the strangest such experiences that I had was in Spain, not in Barcelona, but in Sevilla, where we were encouraged for a project to follow, besides any other research methods that we had to reach the end goal. We're forced for a week or more to follow a method called, I think this is French, so I will butcher the word, but it's a dérive or dérivé. So even on site, so they let us loose, they made us think of an irrational game, construct the rules that was already detached from the problem. And based on that invented game, reach our random analysis and investigation points, and then synthesize that and go towards the rational end game.
Yeah, I think it's also very important to encourage students to do mistakes and to not be embarrassed if they have like wrong answer or they are making mistakes. I think it's important.
I think to motivate students, we should think about how they can motivate us. Because if they can motivate us, we'll find enough motivation to motivate them.
I would insist a little bit on this storytelling thing, and I really try to tell my students to use all these narrative qualities to describe their projects, because it's a nice way to involve contextual, cultural, even personal elements, in a seamless way inside the project. So apart from the elaboration at a technical level, I think it's really important for a whole story, a whole scenario, to appear and then support the whole, the project. But before that, I don't know what's the case in other schools. The first thing we had to do in day one, first year, is to destabilize their opinion, students' opinion of what they're about to do in the next years. Because some of them, or maybe more than some of them, think they're going to design 2-bedroom flat and just that. But it might be that sometime in the end, but they need to make a fresh start. So the first thing is to cancel, preconceptions and prejudices about what they're about to do, and then go on.
Don't give them a task, give them a challenge.
But it's also a skill that is useful later on, that when they enter the world of practice after school, that they know how to question their own preset of certain ideas, what design is and how it kind of should be done, or how research is done. So I think it's a constant mode of questioning where you're coming from and where you're going to. So, but thank you all for these insights and observations. I think there's plenty to think further from. I especially like the direction of storytelling or scenario building, as we often call it, and I would really be curious to learn more about how do you build your frameworks for experimentation and what this piloting, prototyping, all that world means, because ultimately it's also down to this question of scale, that yes, you are able to build perhaps a smaller kind of a prototype, but then what does it actually mean for the world of construction? Can it actually have an impact or influence on the whole sector? So I think there's plenty to think further from. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you all here. We will continue with another discussion tomorrow, and there will be a whole new set of topics set by Jaan and Ioannis. The group of people will be slightly different. So I hope to see you all tomorrow and have a fun symposium day. So, thank you.